And as we celebrate the man who waited decades to be a monarch, spare a thought for his grandson, 11-year-old Prince George. He's already had to grow up fast, mourning the loss of his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, and his mum, Princess Kate, recovering from cancer.
When Maria was dismissed after nearly a decade of loyal service, the world didn't hear a word from her. But behind palace walls, the storm was already brewing. She had been more than just a nanny, she was George's anchor. Through the death of Queen Elizabeth and Princess Kate's cancer battle, Maria remained his constant, his calm. Then, without warning, she was gone. No headlines, no explanation, just silence. And in that silence, the questions exploded. Why was she let go? Was it just timing or something deeper? Had she seen too much? Said too little? Her exit wasn't loud, but the impact was thunderous. George's light dimmed, his routine cracked, and the palace, usually so composed, seemed rattled. This wasn't just the loss of a caregiver, it was the removal of the one person who made royalty feel human for a child born into pressure. And now, without her, everything felt off. So what happened behind the nursery door that turned trust into turbulence? To understand the fallout, we must first return to the beginning of a bond that was never meant to make headlines. Before she ever set foot inside Kensington Palace, Maria was already a master of disappearing. She was trained for it not just to nurture or protect, but to dissolve into the background like a whisper. At Norland College, where elite nannies are forged like soldiers for a silent war, invisibility is not a flaw, it's a virtue. This wasn't your typical childcare certification. It was a rigorous transformation. Students were taught not only how to cradle infants or prepare organic meals, but how to analyze threats in a crowded room, execute evasive driving maneuvers, and maintain absolute discretion under relentless pressure. Norland didn't just teach. Women how to serve it sculpted them into guardians. Quiet, fierce, loyal. Maria Teresa Turion Baralo arrived there not as a prodigy, but as a determined daughter of Spain. Rooted in deep family values and shaped by quiet discipline, she carried a strength that didn't shout, it resonated. She was never drawn to grandeur or attention. Her calm demeanor, strong moral compass, and silent empathy stood out among her peers. While others chased praise, Maria pursued purpose. She didn't need applause. She wanted to matter, and in the lives of children, she knew that quiet influence could last forever. So when Prince William and Catherine began their search for someone to help raise their firstborn in the storm of royalty, they weren't just hiring a nanny. They were handing over their greatest vulnerability. And they didn't want charisma. They wanted control. Not flash, but faith. The vetting process was merciless. Psychological assessments, background sweeps, scenario-based stress interviews, nothing was left to chance. And Maria passed every test, not because she charmed them, but because she didn't try to. Her strength was restraint. Her power was presence. She wasn't chosen because of who she knew. She was chosen because she could be trusted when no one was watching. Because she wouldn't fold under pressure. Because she understood the unspoken language of sacrifice. That being close to power often meant being invisible to it, and she accepted those terms without hesitation. The royal family wasn't looking for someone to raise a child in the traditional sense. They were searching for a stabilizer, someone who could shield George from the harshness of royal expectations while never competing with them, someone who could step in and, at any moment, step out without leaving a trace. That was Maria's gift. She was the calm in the storm, the silence between the shouts. She didn't impose herself into the royal narrative, she became the pulse, behind it. To the world, she remained anonymous. But to George, she was everything. A quiet, steady presence who turned routines into rituals and taught him that love didn't need to be loud to be real. She wasn't the center of his world. She was the foundation beneath it. And within the walls of the nursery, a new kind of royalty was quietly born. She wasn't in the photos, but she was always just outside the frame, while the cameras captured. Birthdays, royal tours, and smiling appearances, Maria remained unseen. But her presence was everywhere, in the way George held his spoon, in the gentle rhythm of his morning routine, in the calm that settled around him, even as the palace stirred with pressure. Maria didn't simply raise a royal. She built a safe haven within the most scrutinized family on earth. Her method was quiet, but relentless. Every day had order, structure, and love woven so tightly together, it became invisible. Breakfast was served at the exact same time. Books lined in his favorite order. Socks folded the way he liked. For most, these were forgettable details. For George, they were safety. But what truly set Maria apart was her ability to speak to the heart of a child without ever raising her voice. George, born into cameras and commands, found in her something rare: honesty, without judgment, routine, without rigidity, and love that asked for nothing in return. On his second birthday, while the world gushed over the official portraits, it was Maria off-camera who waved a plush toy and whispered silly Spanish words to make him laugh. He smiled not for the flash, but for her, because she was there. Always there. She taught him more than manners or routine. She gave him language for emotions most adults never learn to name. One day, after a difficult morning, George stomped into the nursery with crossed arms. Maria knelt and asked, "Are you frustrated or just tired?" Confused, he replied, "Frusted?" She smiled, and in that tiny exchange, she gave him a tool he'd use for life. Her lullabies weren't just melodies, they were anchors. Her corrections were never harsh, only gentle reminders that strength could live in softness. Even in the rigid world of royalty, Maria found ways to share pieces of her heritage. Gracias and buenos dias became their code. On special mornings, George would tiptoe into her room, trying to surprise her with perfect pronunciation. When he succeeded, she didn't clap or cheer. She just smiled deeply, quietly, and he glowed. It was a bond built on mutual understanding, not roles, not just nanny and child, but two souls that trusted each other in a world that trusted no one. Maria gave George a place where he could just be a boy. No titles, no expectations, just puzzles on rainy days and soft good nights by the fireplace. She wasn't raising a prince, she was preserving a childhood. That was her mission. That was her power. She understood that inside the nursery, it wasn't about royal image, it was about humanity. And while George may not have realized it then, he was being shaped by the one adult who saw him not as an heir, but as a child first. But even the strongest bonds can't resist the pull of time. Children grow, worlds shift, and the role Maria had mastered with such care was slowly beginning to change. Not with conflict, not with distance, but with evolution. George was growing, and he was beginning to reach for the world beyond her arms. As George grew older, Maria's presence began to shift from central figure to fading shadow. Change rarely arrives with fireworks. In Maria's case, it tiptoed in like a ghost. It started with small things, quiet shifts in rhythm that no one outside the palace would notice. George no longer needed help buttoning his shirt. He insisted on pouring his own juice. And when Maria laid out his clothes in the morning, he'd sometimes swap them for something he liked better. These moments were harmless, even sweet. But for Maria, they were signs. The child she had once carried was beginning to walk taller on his own, and with each small step toward independence, she instinctively stepped back. But it wasn't just George who was changing. The palace itself had begun to move in a different direction. More advisors, more rigid schedules, more meetings that didn't involve her. New figures started to take over pieces of George's development: language tutors, etiquette instructors, protocol advisors. Their intentions were clear: prepare him for what's coming. The weight of responsibility was no longer distant, it was pressing in. And Maria, once central to George's everyday life, found herself standing slightly further from the circle. She didn't protest. She never would. That wasn't her way. Her love had always been quiet, her loyalty unconditional. But even the deepest loyalty can't stop a system from moving forward. Sometimes it feels the shift before it's announced. The palace was evolving, reshaping itself for the next phase. And Maria, whose strength had always been in stillness, felt the ground changing beneath her. Her moments with George became briefer, less intimate. He still looked for her, still left crumpled notes with tiny thank yous, still reached for her in moments of frustration. But the distance was growing, not out of rejection, but out of growth. And she felt it, not in any one dramatic moment, but in the space between moments. The nursery that once felt like a sanctuary was now a waypoint. The bedtime routines she once led were replaced with later nights and longer events. Even the quiet joy of preparing his favorite meals was slowly replaced by dietitians and structured menus. Her presence remained, but it was no longer essential. It was respected, appreciated, but fading. There was still affection, still warmth. George hadn't changed toward her. He was simply outgrowing the world she had built for him. Maria knew this was part of the job, perhaps the hardest part. Loving a child deeply, fully, and knowing from the very beginning that one day you would have to let go without ceremony, without applause, just a quiet withdrawal from the center of their world. She had always known her time would come, but no amount of preparation could dull the ache of feeling it arrive. And though no one said the words out loud, Maria understood what was coming. It was in the glances during meetings she was no longer invited to, in the way the palace staff subtly redirected tasks, in the way George's schedule began to exclude her. And then, on a quiet morning with no fanfare, Maria was summoned. No cameras, no statements, just two trembling hearts trying not to fall apart. The meeting came as quietly as everything else Maria had ever done for the royal family. No grand announcement, no drawn-out conversation, just a private call to a familiar sitting room, where Prince William and Catherine waited, their expressions soft but unreadable. They didn't come with blame or guilt, only gratitude. Catherine's voice, calm and composed, carried words that cracked the air with invisible weight. "You've helped shape the boy he's become," she said. William added with quiet finality, "He's entering a new stage now, and he doesn't need a nanny." That was it, the line Maria had prepared for, but hoped would never come. There were no raised voices, no protests, just stillness. Maria nodded, offering the same poised grace she'd shown since day one. But inside, something shifted. Not in anger, not in shock, but in ache. The ache of knowing her purpose had been fulfilled, and that the fulfillment meant letting go. She didn't ask why. She already knew. In their eyes, George was ready to stand on his own. But in her heart, he would always be the boy who whispered Spanish lullabies and clutched her hand in silence. She walked back through the corridors she knew like the back of her hand. Everything looked the same. But now, it all felt different. The walls that once echoed with George's giggles seemed too quiet. The nursery she had carefully curated felt still, like a memory already fading. And then she saw him, by the window, sketching quietly, as he often did when the world around him grew too loud. He looked up, eyes wide, not with fear, but with something even heavier understanding. "Mom told me," he said softly, standing still. "I don't want things to change." Maria knelt in front of him, brushing a stray lock of hair behind his ear, just like she had since he was a toddler. "You're growing up," she whispered, "and it's time." He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just stared at her, trying to memorize every line of her face. That night, Maria began to pack. Slowly, deliberately. She didn't take much, only what mattered. A small stack of children's books, a worn plush toy from George's third birthday, a drawing he'd made of their favorite garden bench, and her private notebook, filled with years of reflections, observations, and the untold love of someone who had never once broken the code of silence she swore to. The next morning, she followed the same routine one last time. Walked George to breakfast. Sat with him in their usual corner. But today, he slid a small wrapped parcel across the table. "It's for you," he said. Inside was a leather notebook, nearly identical to her own. On the first page, written in his careful, imperfect handwriting, were just 8 words. "Thank you for being my first teacher." Maria didn't cry, but something inside her did. Not from sorrow, but from a fullness that only love can bring. She hugged him tightly, memorizing the warmth, the smell of his hair, the rhythm of his breath. And then, as always, she let go. She left through the back stairs the same way she entered nearly a decade ago. No send-off, no press, no applause. Just a quiet woman carrying a small suitcase and a heavy heart. And though the world outside would never know what had just ended, for one little boy inside the palace, everything had changed. But Maria's story didn't end when the palace gates closed behind her. She left without a word, but the silence she carried spoke volumes. Maria stepped out of the palace and into a world that felt foreign, quieter, slower, smaller. She settled into a modest flat tucked away in West London, surrounded by ordinary things. The sound of distant buses, the click of a kettle, the creak of an old floorboard under her morning steps. But for someone who had lived according to the ticking of a palace clock, the stillness felt almost deafening. Her body woke at 5:30 a.m., instinctively awaiting footsteps that would never come. She glanced at her phone out of habit, expecting schedules, reminders, or the voice of a palace aide. Instead, there was only silence. Yet, within that silence, Maria began to listen to something new herself. Her memories clung tightly, arriving in fragments throughout the day. She would open a cabinet and recall George's tiny hand reaching for the cereal box he insisted on choosing. She'd hear a child's laugh in the street and, just for a moment, mistake it for his. Her apartment was filled with echoes, silent but vivid, haunting but comforting. It wasn't grief she carried. It was love, stretching itself into the quiet corners of her life. Updates from the palace arrived occasionally. A brief message about George adjusting well to his new routine. A package with a cardigan she must have forgotten, folded neatly beside a crumpled drawing of a dog. No card. No explanation. Just a sketch she pressed to her chest and whispered to Gracias. Not out of sadness, but gratitude. A simple acknowledgement of the chapter they shared. She didn't chase the spotlight, didn't seek pity. She had walked away from a world of power, not out of rejection, but out of purpose. In time, she began to find peace in the calm. She visited old friends from Norland, shared tea with retired nannies, and spoke little about the life she had left behind. When asked about her time in the palace, her answers were short, soft, and full of grace. It was beautiful, she'd say, and hard. That was all. No embellishment, no dramatics. Because for Maria, the most sacred parts of life didn't need to be explained. They only needed to be remembered. And then, months later, a call came. It was the palace. George was preparing for his first major public appearance abroad. He had one request for her to accompany him, just for a week. No press, no attention, no announcement. Maria returned the way she had always come and gone through the back gate. And there he was, taller, sharper, yet still the same boy who once whispered lullabies in broken Spanish. They reviewed his schedule, discussed his meals, went over his speeches. It felt like slipping into a rhythm neither had fully lost. Before she left, George handed her a folded piece of paper. On the train ride home, she opened it. It was another dog, this one labeled Marta. No explanation, just a quiet message from a boy who still remembered the woman who gave him his first sense of home. But what looked like a quiet retirement was actually the beginning of something remarkable. Her revenge wasn't scandal, it was legacy. While tabloids speculated about secret recordings and hush-money scandals, Maria did something far more powerful. She stayed silent, but she didn't disappear. Instead, she built something that would outlast headlines and echo louder than any televised interview ever could. She called it quiet hands, a phrase she used often with George whenever the world became too much. Quiet hands, George, she'd whisper, calming his nerves with the simplest of gestures. Now, that same phrase became the name of a program designed to give strength to those who had spent their lives in silence. Quiet Hands wasn't flashy. It didn't seek royal attention or social media fame, but behind its modest name was a revolutionary mission to create a support network for nannies like Maria, women who had dedicated their lives to children only to be dismissed quietly, with little acknowledgement and no transition. These were the invisible anchors of countless households, And for the first time, someone was giving them a voice. Maria began hosting workshops, offering mentorship, and guiding former caregivers through the emotional chaos that followed an exit no one ever prepares you for. She taught them how to leave with dignity, how to hold their heads high even as the world moved on without a thank you. She showed them how to find their identity again, not just as former employees, but as women of resilience and worth. The testimonials were quietly devastating. One nanny spoke of feeling discarded after 20 years with a family. Another admitted she had forgotten how to introduce herself without referencing the child she once raised. But with Maria's help, they found strength in their stories. Not shame, not regret. Power. And though Maria never once used her royal connections to promote the project, word spread quickly. Quiet Hands became a sanctuary, a place where silent sacrifices were finally seen, where devotion wasn't taken for granted, where exits were honored, not erased. And through it all, Maria never mentioned George, never uttered the names of the people she once served. She didn't have to. Her wisdom spoke volumes. The way she listened, the way she knew everyone sensed it. She had lived through something profound, something beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. Yet while Maria quietly built this legacy, something unexpected was happening behind palace walls. Whispers returned, whispers of a shift, of something missing. George still carried the notebook she gave him, still asked questions only Maria had once answered. Advisors noted a new distance in him, a growing sense of seriousness, a quiet maturity that sometimes felt hollow. The nursery's warmth had vanished, and in its place was a carefully curated silence. Maria didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her revenge wasn't in bitterness. It was in what she left behind, a reminder that sometimes the most vital presence is the one no longer there. She had not taken anything from the palace. She had simply shown them what they lost, because sometimes the most lasting impact is the one you feel in someone's absence. George smiled in public, but behind closed doors, he still carried her notebook. The boy who once darted through palace halls laughing at silly jokes in Spanish now walked a little straighter, spoke a little softer, and laughed a little less. He was composed, dignified, everything a future king is expected to be, but something vital had changed. The spark that once lit up his private moments had dimmed, and though his posture was perfect and his words rehearsed, those who truly knew him began to whisper. They saw it in his silences, in the way he lingered near old spaces they once shared, and in the quiet grip he had on the leather-bound notebook she left behind. A gift, a memory, a message he wasn't ready to let go of. Those close to the family noticed it first, not in scandalous ways, but in subtleties. In the absence of impromptu giggles, in the stiffness of new routines, Maria had been more than a caretaker. She had been an emotional anchor, a bridge between the rigid expectations of royal life and the tender vulnerability of childhood. When she left, that bridge vanished, and George was left standing on the edge of something he wasn't fully ready for. He performed his duties, he followed the schedule, but his warmth, his innocence was thinning. Royal insiders, speaking on strict condition of anonymity, began acknowledging what the palace would never officially admit. She was irreplaceable, one said. There's a reason he smiled more when she was around. Another mentioned how even palace aides felt her absence, how the nursery, once a sanctuary, had become just another wing of the house. The laughter that had once spilled from its doors now echoed like a memory no one dared speak of too loudly. William and Catherine remained publicly silent. They offered no statements, no regrets. Their decision had been clear and calculated. They had acted with love, yes, but also with logic. George needed to mature. He needed to grow into his role. And perhaps, in their eyes, Maria's presence, though beloved, represented a childhood they believed it was time for him to leave behind. But there's a difference between growing up and being rushed. And the consequences of that decision, though quiet, began to show. Teachers noticed a change. He's still incredibly polite, one reportedly said. But he seems older now, tired sometimes, like he's carrying more than he should. George never mentioned her name. He didn't have to. Her influence lingered in his choice of words, in his pauses before answering, in the notebook he sometimes kept with him during quiet moments. Her handwriting, her thoughts, her legacy, it was still guiding him, even when her hands no longer could. Removing someone like Maria wasn't just a staffing change, it was the quiet extraction of comfort, of familiarity, of love without judgment. And in the high-stakes world of royalty, where appearances are everything, emotional truth is often buried beneath duty. But that doesn't mean it disappears, because long after public attention faded, one truth remained. She didn't raise a king, she raised a human. Long before the world began shaping George into a symbol, Maria shaped him into a soul. Her voice, though no longer present, still echoed in the quiet choices he made, how he spoke to strangers, how he paused to listen, how he asked questions not just for answers, but for understanding. In a world that demanded composure and image, she had taught him something far more powerful: how to feel. Not just perform empathy, but embody it. Not just wear the crown, but carry the weight of others with grace. The evidence of her influence didn't show up in grand gestures. It showed in the small, easily overlooked details. The way George made eye contact with staff others ignored. The way he folded notes carefully before handing them to his teachers. The way he still whispered "gracias" under his breath when overwhelmed. These weren't random quirks. They were fragments of Maria's presence, stitched quietly into the fabric of who he was becoming. She had been his first mirror, showing him how to reflect love instead of power, patience instead of pressure. And though the world saw a prince, those closest to him saw the boy she had nurtured. He notices when someone's upset. One teacher remarked, he asks questions other kids don't. Questions like, why do people wave at us if they don't know us? Or, do all children have someone to tuck them in? These weren't palace-scripted curiosities. They were remnants of conversations he'd once shared with Maria. Conversations not rooted in protocol, but in truth. George never boasted about her. He never had to. Her memory lived in him like a quiet ember, glowing just beneath the surface. He kept the notebook she gave him close, tucked inside his desk drawer, returned to it when the world grew too loud. Sometimes he added to it drawings, phrases, thoughts he knew only she would understand. And in those moments, she was there. Not in body, but in spirit, in guidance, in grace. The palace may have moved on. Schedules resumed. Tutors came and went. But something in George remained untouched. A part of him had been shaped not by tradition, but by love. A love so quiet, it was almost invisible, yet so strong it couldn't be erased. That was Maria's triumph. She didn't need the world to know her. She only needed him to remember. And he did. Every time he reached out to someone, overlooked. Every time he chose kindness over image. Every time he paused long enough to feel instead of react. He was living proof that the loudest lessons are often the ones never spoken aloud. Maria's legacy wasn't made of milestones or medals. It was written in the way George treats people when no one is watching. In the strength he shows through softness. In the calm he carries into chaos. That is the royalty she gave him, not of title, but of character. And so, while the world debated headlines and speculated on palace politics, the most important part of Maria's story remained untouched by noise. She didn't burn bridges. She built something far more enduring. A boy with a heart. A future king who knows how to feel. Because her revenge wasn't destruction, it was devotion. And that, more than anything, left the world stunned. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.